Good afternoon, everyone tuning in at home. My name is Samantha Shokin. I am Manager of Public Programs at the Museum of Jewish Heritage, a living memorial to the Holocaust in New York City. I'm pleased to welcome those watching at home to the museum's very first digital public program with author Helen Epstein, whose mother's memoir, Francie's War, is out now with Penguin Random House. We had initially planned for this event to take place last week at the museum, but given the situation at hand, we're thrilled to bring this program to our viewers at home. So I'm joined here via Zoom by Helen Epstein, who is in Massachusetts. Are you in Boston or?
I'm outside of Boston, yeah.
Outside of Boston, great. So Helen is a veteran journalist and author who has written, translated, or edited 10 books of nonfiction, including the trilogy Children of the Holocaust, Where She Came From, A Daughter's Search for Her Mother's History, and The Long Half-Lives of Love and Trauma. Born in Prague in 1947, Helen grew up in New York City, where she went to Hunter High School and then graduated from Hebrew University in Jerusalem. She became a journalist while a college student caught in the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia in 1968. Her account was published in the Jerusalem Post, where she began her reporting career. After returning to New York, Helen freelanced for the Sunday New York Times and other publications while teaching journalism at NYU. She specialized in profiling cultural figures such as art historian Meyer Shapiro, theater producer Joseph Papp, and musicians Vladimir Horowitz and Leonard Bernstein. Her books have been translated into Czech, Hungarian, French, Italian, Swedish, Dutch, German, Japanese, and Chinese. She lives in Massachusetts, from where she is joining us today. So welcome, Helen.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for taking the time to participate in this virtual book launch, my first virtual book launch, maybe yours too. And I'm disappointed that I won't be talking about my mother's memoir with you in person, but I'm thrilled that the Museum of Jewish Heritage has decided to launch this series of free digital programs. Let me start by showing you the American edition of Francie's War, published this week in the United States by Penguin Paperbacks. Do you see it? Samantha,
Yep.
is that good? Good.
Yep, it's great. You could hold it back and up a little bit so we can see the whole thing. A little bit higher, like a couple more inches. Yeah, and closer to you so we see the thing in full. Yeah.
Great.
Yeah, great. Yeah.
So next week, it will be published in the United Kingdom and then in Czech, Slovak, French, Italian, Portuguese, and Russian translations. This is an unexpected and astonishing success, decades after my mother, Franci Rabinek Epstein, wrote it. Francie originally called her manuscript Round Trip, and she typed it on this onion skin paper. She typed it in English in, we think, 1974 or so. It begins in Prague, where she was born and where she was rounded up for deportation in 1942. And it describes what she thinks of as her round trip from Prague to the camps of Terezin, Auschwitz-Birkenau, the forced labor camps of Neuengamme in Hamburg, to Bergen-Belsen, where she was liberated by the British Army and worked as a translator through the summer of 1945. The round trip ends with her return to Prague that fall of 1945. In 1975, a well-known New York literary agent sent her manuscript to several American publishers, and every one of them rejected it. There are, of course, many reasons why any manuscript gets rejected anytime, but I can't help but think that in 1974, gender had something to do with it. Unlike Elie Wiesel's or Primo Levi's war, Francie's War described a world centered around girls and women. She had been running a fashion salon in March of 1939 when Hitler invaded Prague. Her mother, Pepi Rabinek, had established that salon in 1920, and at the age of 18, in 1938, Francie became the proprietor. My mother, in her book, wrote about that salon, about how she decided to get married in 1940, to have a nose job and an abortion during the German occupation, how she became addicted to cigarettes after she was forcibly separated from her parents in Terezin, how she decided to lie to Dr. Mengele during a selection at Auschwitz and identify herself as an electrician rather than as a dress designer, how she nursed her cousin Kitty's boils in Hamburg with yeast cakes that she stole from a German bakery, how her sister prisoners fell in love and or bartered sex for food with men and women, got pregnant, got sick, died. When her manuscript was rejected in 1975, Francie was disappointed. But of course, many worse things had happened to her. And besides, she had no aspirations to be a published writer. She was a dressmaker whose creative outlet and livelihood was making beautiful clothes. I was then 26 years old, beginning a career as a journalist and already working on what would become my first book, Children of the Holocaust. She gave her manuscript to me to use as a source for my own books. And I used Round Trip as a source both for Children of the Holocaust and for my tri-generational historical memoir of the women in my family, Where She Came From. When I was done with that book, I filed her manuscript away in a drawer. I did not really reread it until the winter of 2018, when a combination of developments, including new fields of scholarship and the Me Too movement, made Round Trip seem newly important. Let me tell you a little bit about the book. In March of 1938, my mother had just turned 18 years old. She lived in Prague, one of the most cosmopolitan cities in the world at that time. Like many of us today, she took her life and her civil rights for granted. Czechoslovakia was a multicultural democracy then, which included people who self-identified as Czechs, Slovaks, Germans, Hungarians, Russians, and Jews. Like Montreal or Jerusalem today, Prague was a bilingual city. Almost everyone spoke rudimentary German and Czech. My mother spoke both languages fluently and was sent to school at Prague's French lycée. She was a privileged child. Let me show you a picture of what she looked like as a child, and you'll get the idea. Her father, Emil Rabinek, was an electrical engineer. Her mother, Pepi Rabinek, ran Salon Weigart, a dressmaking business. Every spring and fall, Francie traveled with her mother to fashion shows in Paris and Berlin. She was in Berlin during the summer of 1936 and so focused on the fashion that she barely noticed the Nazis. In February of 1938, just before the German army annexed Austria, she had been skiing in the Austrian Alps for her 18th birthday present. When she got back to Prague and took over the ownership of Salon Weigart from her mother, she started managing clients, suppliers, and a workroom of seamstresses. 1 year later, in March of 1939, the German army invaded Prague, and the Aryanization of Jewish businesses soon began. Francie was 19 when a German Aryanizer came in and advised her to sell her salon pro forma to one of her employees and to continue working there surreptitiously. She did that for almost 3 more years as anti-Jewish racial laws constricted life in Prague more and more. She begins her book like this in the September of 1942. It was a hot day in the first week of September 1942, and the industrial palace of Prague was teeming with people. Most were lying or sitting on the loose straw on the floor. Others were wandering around in a stunned daze. I had often come to the industrial palace when I was a child, and my father's electrotechnical firm, Koralek and Rabinek, had a booth. I returned home with free samples, balloons, and stacks of glossy catalogs. This time, I would not return home because the industrial palace had been converted to the assembly point for the deportation of undesirables, i.e. Jews, by edict of the Nuremberg race laws. I was 22 and lying with my head in my mother's lap in a sort of stupor. I had just had a tonsillectomy. I had not eaten for a few days and was having trouble breathing the air that was filled with straw dust. My mother kept stroking my hair and trying to make me drink a little water. My father was walking around from one acquaintance to another, hoping to find out what was in store for us. Groups of SS men were storming in and out, yelling orders and rounding up groups of Jewish men to clean the latrines. They made a point of picking out the most distinguished looking older men in the crowd, the men wearing glasses. My father was one of them. When they told me in the hospital that my parents and I had been called up for a transport, the nurse, who was a friend of ours, said, "We can get you out of this because of the surgery." I thought this over for a few minutes and then said, "I'm not letting them go alone. They're too old and they don't have anyone else." My mother was 60 and my father was 65. I couldn't visualize these two people going alone anywhere. And there was a little egotistical motivation too. My husband was already gone. I would have been left all alone. Besides, by September of 1942, I was so fed up with all the restrictions in Prague that I thought any change of scene would be a relief, no matter what was waiting on the other end. I was always like that, unfortunately. My interest in politics at the time was non-existent, and I was only vaguely aware that all four of my grandparents were Jewish. I was carefree, slightly spoiled, and mainly interested in dancing, my business, flirting, and skiing, in that order. Francie's voice, that modern, sardonic, unsparingly candid voice, might have been what editors found so jarring in the 1970s. Unlike the vast majority of women of the time, she was the family breadwinner and a businesswoman and accustomed to being the boss. Unlike the vast majority of American Jewish women of the time, she did not attend synagogue. She substituted literature and art for religious observance. Her place of solace was the concert hall and the opera house. She had studied French, German, Czech, and English literature. She had also studied dress design and construction, her mother's and her own customers, and her employees. I believe that years of interacting with all these people and listening to them came into play when she wrote her book. Round Trip was, at the very least, the fifth narration of her experiences during the Holocaust. She wrote the first while she was still a prisoner in a Nazi slave labor camp in 1944, where she stole a notebook and kept a diary in the form of letters to her mother. After a guard discovered that diary, the camp commandant made her burn it, page by page, in his stove. In New York City in 1955, Francey retold many of her experiences to a Central Park West psychoanalyst. In the 1960s, she told them again to a hostile reparations lawyer for the German government. In 1974, I interviewed her for the American Jewish Committee's collection of Holocaust survivor audio testimonies in the United States. You can now find them at the New York Public Library. Many readers are amazed at the specificity of Francie's memories. How could she remember things in such detail, editors asked me. Many of us are familiar ourselves with the vividness of traumatic memory. We also know that many survivors stayed in close touch and recounted the events of the war to one another over and over again, and of course to their children. In my own case, nothing I read in my mother's memoir was news to me. I had heard all of it before. I had heard some of the episodes many times. In fact, my familiarity with this text was what for a long time blinded me to its importance. One of the most interesting parts of the memoir is how, after she's tattooed in Auschwitz, Francie refers to herself as a number, the number A4116. Some readers found this an ingenious literary device, but Francie herself learned during her psychoanalysis about the psychological defense mechanism of dissociation or splitting that comes into play during trauma and that accounts for her seeing herself as a number. Her description of the process is characteristically specific. I'll set it up for you before reading her description. Her younger, flightier cousin and close friend, Kitty, preceded her from Terezin to the Czech family camp at Auschwitz. Kitty was deported from Terezin a few months before Francie and was desperately awaiting her older cousin. Francie describes her arrival at Auschwitz in the spring of 1944, how she is quarantined and tattooed. Then she describes her psychological response in this way. Kitty came running into the barrack as soon as my quarantine was lifted. Why did you come here, you fool? Don't you know that you're all going to be burned June 20th? The only reason why we from December are still alive is that the bastards want a nice round number for the operation, and there weren't enough of us left from March. Don't you know that to commemorate Masaryk's birthday, they sent 3,750 young people up the chimney? The March transport was brought in to replace them. Nobody leaves here alive. The limit is 6 months and no more. Why on earth did you have to come? I sat there, convinced she had gone raving mad. This could not possibly be my lifelong pal, the social butterfly with beautiful dark eyes that always smiled, even when she was serious. Now her eyes could not hold still even for a moment. They shifted back and forth while she blurted out this totally irrational nonsense. A very strange sensation took hold of me then. I stared down at my newly tattooed arm, and like a badly focused picture in a camera, it slowly detached itself and became 2 arms, but only one had a tattoo. I tried to focus back, but the movement continued until there were 2 of us, me and A4116. I thought, what is she doing here, poor devil? I know her. I'm sorry for her. I'll watch her. She looks just like me. Listen to me, said Kitty. I can see by your face that you don't believe one word I said. Come out and I'll show you. A4116 climbed down from her bunk and followed Kitty out of the camp. There in the distance, Kitty showed her a group of chimneys spewing smoke into the sky. And for the first time since her arrival, she became conscious of a peculiar odor in the air, like burning hair or bones. Still incredulous, A4116 said, but all this is quite impossible. Anyway, how do you know? This is a big camp, and they might just be burning corpses of people who died a natural death. You know how Germans are about cleanliness. Besides, there are enough old and sick people around to keep a crematorium busy. Oh yeah, said Kitty. Then how do you explain that 3,750 people disappeared overnight? They could have been deported somewhere else. This is 1944. There are laws. Shit, you are so naive. The world doesn't give a hoot what happens to us here. For all we know, they might not even believe it if they saw it, just like you. What about your capo, Nina? Why do you think she stayed alive? And with her mother at that. That boyfriend of hers went through all kinds of trouble to stash them away because he knew what was up. Go ask her. Francey wrote about friends, lovers, and sexual barter with a non-judgmental attitude that came from growing up in a cosmopolitan environment where sexuality of all kinds was part of the human landscape. She observed how all kinds of love came into play in situations of extremity. Love between mothers and daughters, love between more distant relatives, love between friends, lovers for life or lovers for the moment. She also wrote about love for one's culture and country and love for life itself. These days, Francie's War, and an informative and matter-of-fact memoir, can also be read as a survival guide. How did she survive? Let me count the ways. She refused to take her situation personally. She saw herself as part of a very large group and refused to feel sorry for herself alone. She kept her eyes and ears open. She read situations and people as best she could and acted accordingly. She kept her friends close and formed alliances where she could, even taking care of a young orphan while she was in Terezin and Auschwitz. She tried to find meaning in feeling useful and performing work she knew how to do, making and repairing clothing, both as the forced labor she was assigned to perform and for friends, favors, and food. She sought solace in memories of her parents, of her first great love, of favorite poems, songs, and music. She took one day at a time and clung to the conviction that she would get through whatever happened. Francey often referred to the concentration camps as her university, where she had received a unique education in human behavior. Her greatest concern was that due to human nature, what happened to her could happen again in a different form to anyone, anywhere in the world. She left that conviction as a legacy to her children, and I'm finding it very helpful now. Thank you, and I'd be happy to answer your questions.
Thank you so much, Helen, for that beautiful and moving reading. While we wait for people to send in their questions to us on Facebook, I will start with a few of my own. So my first question, you mentioned, Helen, that the Me Too movement and new fields of scholarship made Francie's memoir seem newly important to you. Can you speak to that a bit more? What were the new fields of scholarship that inspired you, and why did you decide to bring this to light then?
Well, there are many new fields of scholarship that have developed since my mother wrote this memoir. In no particular order, trauma studies is a huge field of scholarship. And I think that certainly her description of her experiences and how she coped with them during the war and after, because she talks about after the war for a little bit as well, are of great interest to trauma studies. For feminist studies, there has been so little work done relatively on women's experiences, not only in the Holocaust, but in war in general and in genocides in particular. And I think that my mother's memoir provides extraordinary source material for scholars, both of the Holocaust and of feminism and of women's studies. Because it focuses almost exclusively on the experiences of women with a very, very close, observant eye. So those are a couple of new fields of study. Now, for the old fields of study, it's also new source material. I think anyone who's interested in memoirs would find it fascinating. I think anyone who's interested in European studies would find it fascinating. When I first reread the manuscript, it really never occurred to me that it would be a commercial book. I certainly never thought that 8 different publishers all over the world would buy it. I thought it would be a great resource for young women historians and people who were working with academic sources. So what I did was I wrote to about 5 or 6 friends of mine who are professors in these fields. And I said, could you take a look at this, please, and recommend an academic publisher? And everybody who read it wrote back, this is fabulous, you should try and get this published commercially. I still didn't believe them. So I thought, okay, well, the best place, the place where it would find the best readership would be in the former Czechoslovakia, because it's so Czech and it refers to so many Czech places. So one place, one episode, which is quintessentially Czech, is in 1939, long before she was deported. My mother was arrested by the Gestapo for reasons that had nothing to do with being Jewish. It had to do with the fact that her then boyfriend his mother had been smuggling jewelry. So she wound up in the most famous prison in Prague called Pankrác, which is in Czechoslovakia, it's like saying Sing Sing. Everybody knows what Pankrác is. And she describes this incredible scene in Pankrác. So I thought, okay, this is going to be, Czechs are going to love this. So I sent it to a friend in Prague who's a literary agent. And she read it. She said, this is fabulous. I'm sure I can sell this. And in fact, 3 major publishers bid on it. So that's how that happened.
Great. So we've actually gotten a lot of questions and I'm trying to keep track of them. The first question comes from Taylor Gardner. Telling Mengele that Francie was an electrician, was she ever called upon for any electrician skills? How did that play out?
That's a great question, and it did play out. My mother, as I said, her father had been an electrical engineer, and he was a man who hadn't wanted to have children. And when his wife got pregnant, he certainly didn't want to have a girl. He wanted to have a boy. And so when my mother was born, and remember, this is in 1920, instead of bringing her dolls as gifts, he brought home electrical supplies from his business because he had an electrotechnical supply company. So when she got to Auschwitz and was selected, this was for a transport out of Auschwitz. I believe it was the first transport of women out of Auschwitz. She was asked what her profession was. And of course, she realized that suddenly all the women around her were claiming to be dressmakers because every woman at that time knew how to sew. And here she was, a professional dressmaker, but it wasn't good enough. And she also had a scar on her right side from an appendectomy. And Dr. Mengele was reputed not to like scars. So it just occurred to her on the spur of the moment to say that she was an electrician because she did have this minimal experience working with wires. And sure enough, she figured it would never come up again. But Germans being extremely methodical, she got to her forced labor camp in Hamburg, and sure enough, she was called upon to work as an electrician. And she basically made it up as she went along. And in Francie's War, she describes very graphically how that came into play. And you'll have to read it. It's really fabulous.
Wow, that is incredible. What a cliffhanger for our viewers watching. A few more questions.
I should also add a little footnote here. One of my brothers grew up to become an electrician.
Keeping it in the family.
Right.
That's great. Next question comes from Elizabeth Edelstein, who's a staffer at the museum. She asks, what aspect of the memoir feels especially complicated or unresolved to you?
Well, I think the part that almost everybody who reads it, and certainly me, the sexual issues are extremely complicated. When do you decide to basically barter your sexuality for survival purposes? Who can judge anybody else who's doing it? What would be acceptable reasons for you to barter your sexuality? For my mother, one of the things she writes about, and certainly things she told me over and over again as a child, was that daughters had saved their mothers' lives by sleeping with a guard or a more powerful person. And I heard this so often as a child that I didn't think there was anything weird about it. But of course, reading it as an adult, it was extremely disturbing to me. And it was disturbing to know that I had grown up with this idea. My mother also continued to be a dress designer when I was a child, and her business was at home. And I grew up with customers in our living room talking about their affairs, their boyfriends. Many of them were being kept by men. And of course, being a rather intelligent child, I realized that there was this continuity between behavior of women in concentration camps and behavior of women in my mother's salon. I found that extremely disturbing as I was growing up to be a woman. And I actually wrote about a lot of that stuff in my book, The Long Half-Lives of Love and Trauma, which is about how long these kinds of childhood impressions and behaviors last into adulthood.
This next question comes from Lydia Kahn, who says that that it's lovely to be watching you doing this reading. Can you talk a little bit more about how it is to have this particular book come out at a time of crisis like this, and what the parallels might be, if any?
Oh, I think there are so many parallels. And hi, Lydia, and hi, everybody from my old high school class at Hunter High School. It's really great to know that some of you are out there. I wish I could see you all. What are the parallels? Well, first of all, I think none of us can read about the 1930s and not see parallels in our own nation, in our own time, and in countries all over the world, everywhere. I think it's extremely disturbing. I think that luckily, many of us are not as oblivious to politics as my mother was in the 1930s. I think we read the news. We try to respond both personally and publicly to essentially very, very right-wing movements all over the world. So that's one thing. Now, when many of us are in lockdown, I mean, I'm in lockdown here in Massachusetts. We're not supposed to go out. My pharmacy just actually called me this morning to send me some medication. I'm not supposed to go there to get it because I'm over 70. And when you're in this kind of state of lockdown and you come from a family where you've heard about this kind of thing all your life, you kind of accept it, and it doesn't seem strange to you. It doesn't seem strange to me, the situation we're in. It seems like I'd been prepared for this by my mother all my life. So I guess what I think about is how you can read Francie's War as a survival manual. How did she survive, and what can you learn from her? And what I think she would do, and what she would say in this situation, is keep your friends close, make sure you know what's going on, do what you can to keep yourself sane and alive, see how you can help other people, and keep believing that it'll come to an end sometime.
Yeah, I think all of us can relate to that on some level with what is happening in the world now. This next question comes from Deborah Andrews Steinerman. She asks, how and when did your mother share her survival story with you?
My mother shared her survival story extremely early, and it was a combination of her personality and my personality. I am an outrageous extrovert. I'm always asking questions. I was a very, very early talker. And remember, my mother had that Auschwitz tattoo on her arm. So from the time I was about 2 years old, I was asking her what it was, because I was observant enough to see that other mothers didn't have this tattoo on their arm. I grew up on the Upper West Side of New York City, which was then a very multicultural neighborhood, but there were a lot of American Jewish women. There wasn't a preponderance of Holocaust survivors. So that women with Auschwitz tattoos on their arm were pretty unusual. And remember that I grew up in this fashion salon. So all of my mother's customers who I saw half naked after school, none of them had Auschwitz tattoos on their arms. My mother was the only one who had an Auschwitz tattoo on her arm. So this was very unusual. And I kept pestering her about what it was. And my mother told me what it was. She said it was a tattoo that was put on in prison, and I can't get it off. It's made of indelible ink. And that one question led to another. And as soon as I went to nursery school, which was also before I was 3 years old, I asked how come I didn't have any grandparents, because other kids had grandparents who were picking them up from school. And my mother said they had been murdered by the Germans in the Second World War, and that she had been in prison. So I really can't remember a time that I didn't know about the concentration camps and the Second World War. My father talked much less than my mother, in part because he didn't speak as good English as my mother. My mother was very verbal.
Thank you. I actually have a question of my own that is related to the Auschwitz tattoo of your mother's that you just mentioned. So in the book, Francie begins referring to herself as the number A-4116 after she is tattooed in Auschwitz. So was this an intentional literary device or more of a coping mechanism on her part? And did she ever refer to herself this way when recounting her stories to you?
She never referred to herself that way in recounting her stories to me. But I think that she didn't really see it as a literary device. I think she saw it as her experience that she was recounting as it happened to her. It's fascinating to me to hear readers' reactions to that, because even my editor asked me, do you think the same thing you asked? Do you think this was a conscious literary device? And I have to say, no, it wasn't. This was the way she experienced it. And it is an extremely effective literary device when she remains in the persona of A4116 from her time in Auschwitz until she recovers from typhus and wakes up in a hospital run by the British Army. And then all of a sudden she reverts to the name Francey. And it's a very powerful moment in Francie's War when she does that. But I don't think she constructed it as a literary device.
Gotcha. Thank you for answering that. A couple more questions. This one's from Amanda Barrett. She says, thank you so much for taking the time to share with us. She's looking forward to reading the book. What was the most difficult experience that your mother went through during the war?
I think she would say the most difficult experience she went through during the war was the separation from her parents. She was an only child. Even though her father had initially not wanted to have a child, he became a doting father. She was unbelievably close to her mother. Not only were they best friends, they were business partners. And they shared great love of not only fashion and making clothes, but they went to the opera together, they went to concerts together. And some of the most beautiful pictures, the photographs in the book, are photographs of her and her mother. And so I think when they were separated at Terezin, and her parents were, they were deported to Terezin from the industrial palace, from that very beginning scene. And when they got to Terezin, Francie was allowed to stay because her husband had been one of the first deportees, and he was already a veteran of the camp, and wives were allowed to stay. But her parents were not allowed to stay, and they were deported immediately east, and she never saw them again. And it was a horrendous, terrible, terrible parting, because her father, my grandfather, had this idea that he was going to take his life in his own hands if he had to. And he had what he thought were suicide pills with him, cyanide pills. And my mother, when she was 15, had discovered these pills. And she had taken them to a pharmacy and had saccharin substituted for the cyanide. And she blurted out that those pills weren't going to help him. So their last moments together were just horrendous, because he got furious at her for taking away his right to control his own life. And she always talked about that as being the most difficult experience of her life.
Wow, that's really incredible and hard to conceive. Let's take one or two more questions. This one is from Ellen Bachner Greenberg. She says, hi, Helen, you've said before that even as a grown-up, you didn't know what your mother's number was. Given it was spoken about and you are so insightful, why do you think you couldn't remember it?
I think I dissociated the same way my mother dissociated in the camps. I think I learned that one of the easiest psychological defenses is to just block things out. And I blocked it out. I know the number now. I've worked with the manuscript so much now. And so many people have asked me about that episode in Auschwitz that, of course, now it's emblazoned in my brain. But for a long time growing up, I could not remember that number. And I've met many other offspring of Holocaust survivors whose parents were tattooed who could not remember their parents' number.
Wow. We could take another question, or if you have any closing comments or remarks, we can wrap it up now.
Why don't you take another question?
Okay. This one, sorry, there's so many. This one is from Marcia Feynman Burns. She asks, why did Francie take over the business at age 18?
She took over the business at age 18 because her mother was failing. It's hard to imagine now that women at age 60 could be seen as failing, but her mother had had a difficult life. She had a difficult marriage. And Francie was an extremely authoritative and capable young woman who just really wanted to do it. She was crazy about fashion. Think about people like Diane von Furstenberg, for example, who just really, really fall in love with that whole world and embrace it. And that's what my mother did.
Amazing. Well, thank you again, Helen. I think this is a good time to wrap things up. I want to thank all of our viewers tuning in. If you're interested in the book, it's available now through Penguin Random House. There's a link to the publisher. What's that?
I'm showing it again.
You can see it right there on Helen's screen. We included a link in the description. So go out, buy the book. And hopefully we can do another event like this with you in person, Helen. This was really
That would be great. I'd love to do it. And then you can also meet my extended family in New York. My brothers, two of them, Tom and David Epstein, and my niece Laura, who should be tuned in too. I'm sorry you can't see them all.
That would be amazing. Well, thank you again, Helen. And thank you to all of our viewers for tuning in for the museum's first digital public program.